And I think we're at a critical juncture in this country. You know, as president of SEABOTA, I wrote a column after George Floyd was killed, and I talked about it being an inflection point to equal justice. And I really think we're at an inflection point in our country where I hope that at some point in time, we can look at ourselves and think about treating people better and treating people and not discriminating against people based on their backgrounds and their race.
Hello and welcome to See You in Court, the podcast that informs you about the Georgia civil justice system, what it means to you, and how it protects individual rights. This podcast is a collaboration between the Georgia Civil Justice Foundation and the Georgia Institute of Technology. Your hosts are robinfrazierclark and lestertate, who are both past presidents of the State Bar of Georgia and currently serve on the board of directors of the Georgia Civil Justice Foundation. And now this episode of See You in Court.
Good morning, friends and lovers of the law. Welcome to See You in Court. I'm Lester Tate, and with me is Robin Frazier-Clark, my co-host. Robin, how are you today?
Hey, Lester, doing great. It's a great day, and on my other monitor, I was watching Vanderbilt and Florida play in the SEC basketball tournament, and unfortunately, Vandy is not doing so well at half.
Well, I'm watching my alma mater, Georgia Tech. Robin's a Vandy grad. I'm a Georgia Tech grad, and Georgia Tech is trailing Miami, but only by 4 points with about 30 seconds to go. So we're all with March Madness of some type today. Yep. But I want to tell you about our guest because I'm really thrilled to have Lutherbattiste of Columbia, South Carolina, with us today. Luther is a founding shareholder of Johnson, Toal Battiste. He's a graduate of the University of South Carolina and of Emory Law School, and is a trial lawyer there. And he is the immediate past president of the American Board of Trial Advocates, the national president for American Board of Trial Advocates, which is an organization dedicated to the preservation of jury trials. Robin and I are both members, both proud members. And Luther and I sort of have a special relationship because I'm a Georgia boy, but to get my legal education, I went over to South Carolina. And Luther is a South Carolina guy and came down to Emory, where Robin went to law school, to get his legal education. And then we both went back to our home states, and it was through SEABOTA and through just a ton of mutual friends that we have met. And Luther's been a great friend and mentor to me, got me involved in SEABOTA stuff. And so I want to tell you a little bit about him because I view Luther as really being a pioneer in so many areas. After going back to South Carolina in 1983, Luther entered the political arena and made history by becoming one of the first two African Americans elected to the Columbia City Council since Reconstruction. And that's how I first heard of Luther, because I'd heard of him for many years because I started law school in 1985. So you would have been on the city council then. He served as Mayor Pro Tem of the city of Columbia, and the city of Columbia has dedicated a Monument and Plaza in his honor as a public servant. He's been repeatedly selected for inclusion in the best lawyers in America and super lawyers, and has been awarded an AV rating by Martindale-Hubbell, which is the highest rating which Martindale-Hubbell gives. He's a member of SEABOTA, and like I said, the national president, past national president, and was also president of SEABOTA, the Southeastern chapter of American Board of Trial Advocates. He's a member of the John Belton O'Neill Inns of Court, the Southern Trial Lawyers Association, American Association for Justice, the National Bar Association, South Carolina Association for Justice, Injured Workers Advocates, the American Trial Lawyers Association. And again, I'll come back to the fact that he was the national president for SEABOTA. For those of you who don't know that, that is a really, really huge deal. And I could go on and on for the remainder of our podcast talking about Luther and his many accolades. But Luther, we want to hear from you today, just a little bit. Welcome to the show. How are you doing in this COVID-19 era we're living in?
I'm doing great, Lester. Thank you and Robin for having me on your great show. I looked at the website and saw all the great people you've had on the show in the past. I'm just honored to be among the number.
Well, we're glad to have you, and I want to start by asking you to just tell us a little bit about your career, about why you went into law. And I've talked about so many of your firsts, and I think I got to bring sort of two of my heroes together earlier before the COVID thing struck, because we were at an ESEABOTA event where I had Robert Benham, who's a former justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, first African-American to attend the University of Georgia Law School. And you together, you were both there together, and you all have had very similar careers in that you've been true pioneers. So I want you to tell me how you decided to go into law, and also, give us some of the background of some of the things that you have pioneered as an African-American lawyer.
Well, first of all, I remember the ESEABOTA event very well, and you spoke before me and had the opportunity, as you said, to introduce your hero, Chief Justice Benham, and you were just brilliant in your introduction. So you put a lot of pressure on me coming behind you. And of course, I used that opportunity to talk about my hero, Judge Matthew Perry, who was one of the premier civil rights lawyers in the country and the first African-American federal judge in the Deep South. And he started out college as my mother's classmate at South Carolina State University, which was then South Carolina State College. And he left to go into World War II and came back and graduated as a part of my dad's college class of 1948. Judge Perry was, because of segregation, they created a separate law school at South Carolina State, and Judge Perry was in the first class. And when he graduated, South Carolina did not have a bar exam. They had what was known as diploma privilege. So if you graduated from the University of South Carolina Law School, you automatically became a lawyer. Because of discrimination, when Judge Perry graduated, they instituted a bar exam. So Judge Perry was just breaking barriers then. He created a bar exam for all the lawyers in South Carolina who were not very happy about that. And Judge Perry went to Spartanburg and later came to Columbia and became the lawyer for the NAACP in South Carolina and began handling cases involving people who were involved in protests. He lost all the cases at the trial level and ultimately won thousands of cases at the appellate level, making fantastic law in South Carolina and changing the course of life in South Carolina for all South Carolinians and making it a better place for all. As a young person growing up in Orangeburg, I had a chance to follow the career of Judge Matthew Perry. And because of him, I wanted to be a lawyer. He was tall, he was handsome, he had a beautiful voice, a presence, an elegance. And because of him, I wanted to go to law school and be like him. And so that's why I went to law school. I was involved in what was called the Orangeburg movement at the time. I was involved in picketing, in marching. My biggest regret during that time period is that I didn't get arrested like my friends. To be arrested fighting for civil rights was a badge of honor. And my group never got arrested. And to this day, I regret never being arrested for civil rights. And being involved in that Orangeburg movement impacted me in so many ways. It helped shape me to be the person that I am and to have a commitment to equal rights that follows me and carries me and energizes me even now. But I've been involved in a lot of things. I was president of the Columbia Lawyers Association. Then I became president of Richland County Bar Association, first African-American president of South Carolina Trial Lawyers Association, first African-American president. then became president of SEABOTA, and then ultimately ABOTA. Involved in politics for 15 years. I ran in an 8-person race. The first time I ran, won in a runoff 2-1, and was never opposed again. And I retired, on my own. My law partner was one of the first 3 African Americans, I.S. Levy Johnson, elected to the South Carolina legislature. And when he retired, he said he retired because of illness. He said the public got sick of it. So,
That's great.
I like to think I retired on my own terms. So that's kind of a little bit of some of the things I've been involved in. I'm very involved in matters other than law. Also, I'm very interested in the arts and was served as a chair.
We're going to talk about your jazz show here too, and get you a little plug for that in a minute. But when you first started practice after you got out of law school, you clerked, I believe, for Judge Perry, if I remember correctly.
No, let me tell you a little bit about that.
Sure.
When I was in college, I mentioned my partner, I.S. Levy Johnson, being one of the first 3 African Americans since Reconstruction. And there was an organization in Atlanta, based in Atlanta, the Voter Education Project. And they hired me to work for him. And my last year in college, I worked in his law office, assisting him doing his legislative work, and then doing some other stuff, some legal stuff. And when I went to Emory, my first year, I worked at the Georgia legislature, and I worked with Ben Brown and Julian Bond, Senator later Judge Horace Ward, at the legislature, doing a very exciting time. And I did that. And then I clerked for Judge Horace Ward, who I think was the first Black federal judge.
Yes.
In Georgia. It's interesting. Judge Ward worked for Attorney Hollowell, who's a Georgia legend. And one of the people that clerked for them was Vernon Jordan.
I was going to say, I read Vernon Jordan's book, Vernon Can Read, and he talks about working for Donald Hollowell, who represented Charlene Hunter Galt and Hamilton Holmes, the first 2 undergraduates admitted at the University of Georgia.
And I think Judge Ward and Attorney Hollowell were practicing law together at that time, during that time period. I'm convinced that Judge Ward hired me to be his law clerk because he didn't drive, and what he really wanted was a chauffeur. But I really got an interesting. We had such wonderful conversations, and he gave me so much background on the experiences he had. He represented Martin Luther King. He had an office on what was then Hunter Street, which is now Martin Luther King Drive. And so I was right down the street from the original Pascals, and it was just a wonderful time to be in Atlanta when I was there from 1971 to 1974. And then I came back to Columbia and came back and went to practice with I.S. Levy Johnson, the person who I clerked for in college. And he and I have been together for 46 years. It's the only job I've ever had. Our first year into the practice, I'd been there 2 months, and he was 33 years old and had a heart attack. And I had to run the business, the law firm, while he was gone. And when he was in the hospital, a person who later became Chief Justice Jean Toal and her husband, Bill Toal, who was then a law professor at the University of South Carolina, visited him in the hospital. He was unhappy with being a law professor, and IS invited him to join us. And then we formed Johnson, Toal Battiste, which was the first law firm integrated at the partner level since Reconstruction. At one time, I thought we were the first, and then I was doing some research and saw during Reconstruction that there was an integrated firm in Columbia. And so we were very different at that time. And it was interesting how the firm was named. My partner said the logical thing was I was there first, so my name would be second. And my partner, I think, thought it would be more powerful having the Toal name second. So he told me if my name was last, everybody would remember that more. So that's how we formed Johnson, Toal Battiste. And so we stayed together. Bill retired about 2 years ago, still is available if we need to do work, but he's really enjoying being a grandparent and a part-time golfer and staying at home.
Luther, my connection, I have a tiny one to South Carolina. I clerked in Charleston when I was in law school, so that would have been in 86 and 87. My office was at 150 Meeting Street, and back then, I'm just amazed at your firm and your career, because wow, it's so. And back in the mid 80s in Charleston, South Carolina, 2 summers I spent, I don't think I ever saw an African American lawyer in anything I did, anywhere I went. I don't recall that.
Right.
So your story is amazing and so impressive and historic. And you mentioned Judge Ward. I wrote about Judge Ward once, and what all you could call it is poetic justice for him to end up on the bench after everything he went through. And I hear your story about your one regret is you didn't get arrested, and I think, man, that is that's justice too. That you've done so much for your community. And civil rights. It's my hat's off to you, and God bless you for doing all that. It's amazing to me.
Well, when you went to Emory also, right?
I did. I went to Emory. I graduated in 88.
Was Professor Ferguson still there when you were there?
Oh yeah, sure. Yes.
Did you take any classes from him?
I had my first civil procedure with him. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I went back to Emory for one of our reunions, and I was at a cocktail party, and he had a glass of wine and I had a glass of wine, and I said, I can't believe I'm standing here with Professor Ferguson. He's not screaming at me. He's talking in a low tone of voice, because he was a very intimidating teacher when we were there.
It was very intimidating, and I can remember a particular question. So this would be in 1985. That far, but I still remember that's how traumatic it was. But I can remember he asked me what a pleading was, and I did.
That reminds me of a story. We had this law clerk come in for her first day, and so I invited her to attend the deposition. And we were sitting in the room, and before the deposition started, without talking to me or anything, she just said, "I have a question." And she said, "What is a deposition?" And I said to her, I said, "I don't think I would have asked that question." But when I went to Emory, when I went to Emory, most of the people in my class, I think, aspired to work in big law firms. And it was really interesting. My last year, they passed a rule that you could take the bar exam, I think, at the February testing period.
Yeah.
And and I didn't take it, but everybody in my class that took it passed the bar exam. So the majority of my class, when we graduated on June the 6th, 1974, they were ready to be lawyers, and I had to go back and take the bar review course and take the bar exam.
I went summers while I was at South Carolina. So I actually availed myself of that rule to take the bar the summer after my second year, because I was going to graduate in December. And I had a job in Atlanta. I worked for Smith, Gambrell, and Russell. And I took the bar and I passed it. So I had to go back and graduate. And I thought, since I'd gone to law school in South Carolina, I'd take the bar over there, but you couldn't take it till after you'd graduated. And after I'd made it through, there was no way I was going to go back, and start studying for it. I was already off and running. But therein, you have the only thing that I was ever first in my class in. I was the first person to become a lawyer, but other than that, had no other first.
But when I went to Emory, it was always my intention to come back to South Carolina. The legendary dean of the law school at Howard University was a man named Charles Hamilton Houston. And he believed at that time that African-American lawyers had a responsibility to be social engineers. to go back in the community and try to make a difference. So even though I went to law school at Emory, it was always my desire to go back to South Carolina and to try to make a difference in the community, try to make it a better place. So if you look at what I've tried to do in my life, that's what I've been trying to do since I came back.
So I'm privileged to be on a committee that the Georgia Bar has called the Equal Justice Committee. Our president, Don Jones, has set that up. And one of the things that we've been doing is trying to get people of, and not just African Americans, but people of all races, creeds, and colors and genders to say, to talk about their experience, and to share their experience so that others understand that. So what was it like going back to South Carolina, which still is in many ways a rural state, and as a young African-American lawyer? I remember when I clerked for our friend Richard Gergel, when he was practicing law, I went to Johns Island one night for a hearing, and I was the only white person in the hearing room, I think, for a little while.
School board hearing?
Yeah, school board hearing. Yes, had a constituent board out there.
Right.
And I remember thinking, I'm not the defendant. I'm not really, made nervous, by any of this. But it gave me a little taste, of what it's like to look around and see a lot of people that aren't like you, that you need to communicate with and get along with. What was it like when you went back to South Carolina?
I was very lucky. When I chose to go to work with I.S. Levy Johnson, he was a person that was well known in the community. He was an excellent trial lawyer, particularly criminal trial lawyer. And I went everywhere with him. And what happened was that the goodwill that he had developed was transferred to me. It was an instant entree for me into the legal community and into the community in general. And so that really gave me an advantage. Back during that time period, when I first started practicing law, you didn't have a lot of Black lawyers, but you had some. And so because of the relationship my partner had, it helped me with the judges. I immediately got active in the South Carolina Trial Lawyers Association. I remember the summer of 1975 going to Hilton Head for annual Trial Lawyers Convention. And I said to myself, I didn't know any place this nice was in South Carolina. Hilton Head back in 1975 was a fabulous place. But when you went to the Trial Lawyers Convention, all the judges were there. And so there were not many Black lawyers, and we were there. We had a presence there. He was in the legislature. They elected the judges from the legislature. And so, I was able to get to know judges all over the state and have his goodwill transferred to me. So I was really lucky in terms of having that kind of connection. And it seems like my life has always been that I've been in a situation where I had good connections, and being involved in the trial lawyers was the best thing I ever did. It made me a player in a sense. People recognized me. Not hard to stand out in the crowd. Being an African American in 1975 in a situation that's pretty much all white, and so I just utilized that and just got involved in bar activities and got involved in trying cases and going to court, and did that pretty much for 10 years before I got involved in politics, for about 8 years. And then that changed everything.
When you were trying cases when starting out and in South Carolina, did you feel like you were well received by your juries, being African American?
Well received is probably not the right word. I think that probably then we could win cases. I think that even given the racial attitudes then, I found that juries made a decision based on the facts. When I first started out, I tried a lot of criminal cases. That's primarily what I did. I went to city court every day before I went to work. and did cases there, did cases in magistrate's court, tried cases in circuit court. I got a chance to start out trying cases with my partner, and every case he tried, I tried. So I was constantly in court, learning how to try cases from the very beginning. I was really lucky to be able to do that.
So one of the things that for SEABOTA, this organization that we're all a member of, you have to have tried so many civil cases. I think it's 10 now for young lawyers who have difficulty getting those 10 cases. I'm a little bit younger than you. I had 50. I know when I got in to SEABOTA. Do you believe that there are just fewer cases getting tried, or do you think that there are lawyers that are unwilling to try cases now, or how do you see that part of our profession? I
see all of the above. We have a federal judge in South Carolina, Joe Anderson, who's also an SEABOTA diplomat. You have to be unanimously voted into SEABOTA that way. And he tells a story about two lawyers in the future, old lawyers in rocking chairs, and one lawyer says to the other, he says, that was a great opening statement I gave in mediation. Because what's happening now is, for whatever reason, cases aren't being tried like they were before. I think we all, to some extent, have become great mediation lawyers, and we expect cases to resolve at that point rather than go into a trial. And there are absolutely fewer cases being tried on the civil side now than before. I don't know the statistics, but I know in South Carolina, the trials are way down. I think there is a certain fear that people have, fear they have of going in the courtroom and trying cases. I know some people, like my law partner, there's nothing he enjoys more than being in the courtroom. He loves the theater. He loves everything about it, being the center of attention. So I think it is different. I think one of the things about the criminal side is you had to try a lot of those cases because you didn't have any choice.
Right.
That was the only option you had, and I certainly
it's just scary to me to think about. You were talking about, Robin was talking about being asked what is a pleading, and you're talking about somebody asked you what's a deposition. To take Judge Anderson's analogy a bit forward, is it going to be that long before some lawyer says, "What's a trial?"
Exactly.
What's a trial?
Exactly.
I hope not. Well, Luther, I've tried about trials, and one was a criminal case, and it was a murder case.
Wow.
So I can at least say I tried a murder trial to verdict and experience. Talk about stress.
The most stressful case I ever tried was the only death penalty case I tried. And I tried it for
gosh.
Yeah, I tried it for 2 weeks. It was in my hometown of Orangeburg. So I stayed with my mom the entire time. We had the cooling off one day between the actual trial and the penalty phase. And it was interesting. I was so emotionally involved in that case that I was driving back home and I just broke down and cried because of the enormous responsibility you have when you try a case, and whether the person lives or dies, is on your shoulders. I was very fortunate in that case to get a life sentence for my client, but it wasn't without a lot of stress and a lot of hard work to do it. It made me a better lawyer trying that case.
I think that's why I did it. I sat second chair with a criminal defense attorney, and I wanted to experience that. I wanted to see what that was like. And I felt like I did voir dire, for example. I felt like a lot of the things that I knew how to do really well did translate, but it's a big difference when it's just mere money on the line versus someone's life. Right.
It's interesting. SEABOTA, South Carolina SEABOTA, that you mentioned voir dire, because South Carolina SEABOTA had a 1 hour seminar yesterday by Zoom, and we have very limited voir dire in South Carolina. And we had a earlier Zoom meeting, and one of our Supreme Court justices kind of urged us to pursue that. that there's nothing that prohibits voir dire, but as a matter of practice, the judges have not allowed it. So we had a seminar yesterday with three circuit court judges, and we had Judge Jerome Abrams, who's an ABOTA member for Minneapolis, where they have voir dire, and we talked about it yesterday. But the point I was going to make was the only time I really did extensive lawyer-directed voir dire was in my death penalty case, and I had to go study to try to learn how to do it because I'd never done it before. We generally in South Carolina are only allowed to submit questions that the judge asks to the jury.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, very limited in what you can ask.
And in Georgia, we're allowed to do it until stopped by the judge, and it's pretty wide open. And I always promote a robust voir dire. I think it's the most important part of the trial. And I feel like it's a muscle that if you don't exercise it, you lose it. So I'm a very big proponent of a robust voir dire.
We had a lawyer, Ken Suggs, who was president of Trial Lawyers and president of ATLA, now AAJ. And Ken is older than I am and is still actively practicing. And he's tried cases in 20 states and talks about doing voir dire around the country, and how he said he had to learn how to do it and had to do, the trials sessions, with a focus group in order to make sure he learned how to do it right.
If in my experience, I try to have at least 2 or 3 jurors agreeing with my witnesses before they get seated. If I can get away with it, that's the way it goes. So let's talk about ABOTA for just a minute, because you've been in it for a long time. Have reached the pinnacle of ABOTA there. And again, when we say ABOTA, it's ABOTA, American Board of Trial Advocates, which is one of about 3 or 4 nationally recognized honorary trial lawyer societies. Tell us a little bit about what it's like, what ABOTA's mission is, and what it's like to be president of a national organization like that, that's spread really throughout the United States.
Well, American Board of Trial Advocates is an organization of more than 7,600 of the best plaintiff and defense lawyers in the country. Selection to ABOTA is by invitation only. When I became a member, you had to have at least 20 jury trials, civil jury trials to verdict. Now, because of the diminishing jury trial situation, it's down to 10, and people struggle to have that. ABOTA is dedicated to the preservation of the 7th Amendment and the right to jury trial. ABOTA members are expected to be people who have high civility standards. And one of the things that ABOTA tries to do is to continue to teach lawyers through masters in trials and other mechanisms how to be good lawyers. You can't apply to be president. You have to be nominated. It's done by past presidents. They nominate 3 people each year. And you actually have to run in an election that all 7,600 people are eligible to vote. And you can't campaign. You have position statements you have to write your position on. And then to some extent, it becomes a beauty contest in some way. I feel very fortunate that I won when I did, because I won at a time when the country had become very conservative. And I wouldn't have imagined that a person of my background would have been able to win at that time. But I was, I won, became president of ABOTA, became the first African-American president in the history of the organization. And so it's been a great honor to be president. Unfortunately, most of my year as president was during a pandemic. So I think I'll forever be known as the pandemic president of ABOTA. But it's been a wonderful experience for me.
So tell us a little bit about some of ABOTA's programs that some of our listeners may not know about, like the Journalist Law School, Teachers Law School. We have a wide variety of listeners, I hope, not all of whom are lawyers. Well,
ABOTA also has a foundation, and the foundation is a separate organization, has its own set of programs. And a lot of the wonderful programs we have are through the EMORI Foundation. As I talked about, they do a master's in trial, and individual chapters of EMORI have mock trials and bring in the best lawyers in their state and the best lawyers around the country. And in South Carolina, it is very competitive. I mean, there's trash talking that takes place. They really try to win the case, and they really get together and prepare. And I understand it's that way around the country. EMORI also has a teacher's law school where they actually present programs on the law to teachers in particular states. They're doing a national teacher's law school this year, and the focus of it will be on the issue of social justice. So that should be very interesting. There's also a program called Civility Matters. This year, as president, my wife, Judy Battiste, and I introduced a new program. It's the Civics Education Literacy Program. And the goal was for EMORI lawyers to go into the schools and read to kids on civics-related books. One of the biggest challenges we have with our young people now is they don't know much about civics, know a lot less than we did when we came along. And the idea was to let them see good lawyers have a chance to interact directly with the students, and to try to educate these young people about civics and the importance of civics. And so the program was somewhat impacted by the pandemic, but we've been able to do videos and been able to get programs started all over the country in trying to implement the idea that Judy Battiste and I came up with for the Civics Education Literacy Program. So those are some of the programs that EMORI does all the time to try to make a difference in the legal profession.
Our podcast sponsor is the Georgia Civil Justice Foundation, and one of their missions is also education in civics of school children. And we have a website, if EMORI could use it, fairplay.org, that goes in different schools use that to learn about civics. But, you qualified your teaching of that, saying that young people didn't know much about civics, but I'm not sure it's just young people anymore. It's adults too, that I think that need a little civics education.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Our program was geared toward elementary school kids, kids from kindergarten to third grade. I have found from going into schools that those kids are so easy to reach, so willing to learn, so eager for knowledge. So that's why we've kind of focused the program at that age group. And next year, the focus of our civics education literacy program will be on social justice. And so we have a whole new set of books that we're developing to read to the kids in that area. I
want to talk to you a little bit about your jazz radio program. Because I know, because we in EMORI had known of your love of jazz, and you've got a whole following. We were texting about it this last weekend. It comes on, I think, on Sunday night. So I want you to give it a plug, but I want you to also tell me a little bit about how you got interested in jazz and how, if at all, it connects with the law.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you how it connects with the law. I always say that to be a good jazz musician, you have to know how to improvise. And we all know, being trial lawyers in particular, that what we're doing in the courtroom is that we're constantly improvising. We're given a situation, something may be unexpected, and we have to shift and adapt to the situation we have. So we're like jazz musicians. We're improvisers. We're always having to make changes and to react to a situation. When I grew up in my hometown of Orangeburg, South Carolina, one of my dad's brothers lived with us for 4 years. And one of his duties was he had to wax and buff the hardwood floors in our house. And he would put on music that my parents had at the time. And a lot of it was jazz. And I just was very interested in it at the time and just loved the music in general. I had a transistor radio that I would listen to stations all over the country. At that time that I was growing up, and this is not jazz, but there was a program called Randy's Record Shop, and there was a DJ named JR, and you could get in your car in a little town like Orangeburg. The channel was so powerful that you could hear it, and they played great music. There was one out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. And so I was into music because of that, and particularly into jazz. And I just, over a course of time, bought music, listened to music, read about jazz, and it's been a lifelong education for me. I probably have one of the best jazz book collections of anybody. Whenever I travel, I'm in bookstores that sell old books, and I'm collecting the books from the giants who've written about jazz. And I read Downbeat magazine, Jazz Is magazine. I mean, I do everything that I can because I just have this unquenchable quest for knowledge about it. In 2013, there was a real estate developer, John Baker, who had a jazz radio show that he did on a really top-notch station in Columbia called the Palm. And he developed a debilitating illness that would not have allowed him to continue doing the show. So he picked 3 people of divergent backgrounds to take over his show. One was a financial advisor for Smith. Is it Smith Barney? I can't remember the name, but one of the top financial companies. Another was a person who worked at a jazz record store, and me. And we rotated doing the show. And then the station got sold a couple of times. And the show was just all in transition. It ended up with 2 of us doing the show, a guy named Woody Jones and I that worked at the record store. So then the station got bought by a Christian network, and the first thing that they did was they cut out the jazz show. And so I was recruited at that time to go to a radio station in my hometown. And so I immediately went from that station, and I got my own show, and I named it Jazz from the Garden City because my hometown is known as the Garden City. And I did that for a couple of years, and the owner and I had a falling out, or he fell out with me. I think part of the reason was that my show became more popular than his radio station, and he didn't like that. So the engineer of my show got his own station. He became the general manager of a station at Voorhees College, and so we renamed the show World Class Jazz, and we've done it there now for over 2 years. So all the music that I play on the show is from my personal collection. I make all the selections of the music, and I like to tell people that I give them the backstory on the music and the musicians. So I call it World Class Jazz with the backstory. And it's really interesting. The show got picked up several years ago by an organization called Jazz Boston. And Jazz Boston picked the best jazz stations and shows in the world and ran it through their app. And so my show was on that station up until maybe 3 or 4 months ago, and they ran out of funding and shut the app down. But my show is streamed on the internet. I have people listening all over the country. The station recently got hit by storms. It's a small college station. And my friends in SEABOTA, led by Peter Riley, excellent lawyer from Minneapolis, raised over $20,000 for the station to go in and do all the repairs and upgrade the equipment. And they did that within like 12 hours. And Peter says they did it because of how much they liked the show and how much they liked me, which I just was overwhelmed by. So jazz is a passion for me. I love doing the show. I think, and I'm not bragging here, but I think my show is as good as any jazz show in the country. And I'm on every Sunday from 6 to 8 on WVCD 96.5 FM, 790 AM. And you can just go to the Voorhees website and listen, or you can email me at bat@jtbpa.com. I will send you a playlist and a link each Friday to the show. So if you like good jazz, you need to listen to World Class Jazz.
That's very cool, Luther. if we said this is Luther's walk-up song, how they have in Major League Baseball walk-up song, what would be walk-up song in jazz for Luther Battiste?
It could be Miles Davis, All Blue. It could be the actual lead into my show now, Moaning by Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. It could be a couple of songs. When I became president of ESEABOTA, and I walked up to the mic, and I said, I want you to know that I'm the first president ever to host his own, jazz show. People thought I was going to say something else. One of the things I do to have fun with my show is that I do what I call a smooth music set. And I like to say that the music I feature is not necessarily jazz. It may have a jazzy sensibility, or it may be an iconic artist, or it may be some good old school music. Last week I did Earth, Wind & Fire, and this week I'm doing Whitney Houston. I do 3 songs just to change it up a little bit, and it's become a very popular feature of my show.
Well, I love both of them. I love smooth jazz. I would call it smooth jazz. But you mentioned Earth, Wind & Fire. A year ago, we were getting ready to go on a trip to Las Vegas to see Earth, Wind & Fire. And, of course, everything got shut down. So I still haven't seen Earth, Wind & Fire, and I'm still waiting to, be able to do that. Do you play an instrument?
I do not.
You play the radio, though.
Yeah. I don't play an instrument. I don't play an instrument, but I know good music when I hear it.
I noticed that you and Judy, your wife, are also instrumental, no pun intended, in bringing jazz to Columbia.
Yeah, mostly Judy. I met my wife at Emory. She was at Emory undergrad when I was in law school. And we graduated same time and got married a week after I took the bar exam on August 10th. And Judy has been very involved in the arts in Columbia, has received numerous awards for what she's done in arts. And one of the things that she's done, and she's done it at 2 venues, is that she's put together jazz concerts. We have a performing arts center, which is actually right next to my office, called the Township Auditorium. And she came up with a concept to do jazz in the lobby. And she created a jazz series there where after work, they would do jazz in the lobby. And so then she was recruited to do it at a different venue. And she does a program called Jazz at 701 Whaley. And it features local and sometimes national artists. And jazz is offered at a very reasonable price in a wonderful historic venue. And it's just great music. And it's become one of the jazz events in Columbia now. And it's all because of the talent that my wife has at promotion and marketing and picking up and coming good artists. And so my wife is very, 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 very talented in everything that she does, and was very creative in work she did for ESEABOTA. Unfortunately, we only got to do 2 trips this year because of the pandemic. We did one in Charleston, and Lester, you were there for
yes.
that. And we took an international trip to Tanzania and Zanzibar. Ironically, one day a year ago today was the day we were flying back to the United States from Zanzibar. And little did we know how much the world would change at that time, how much our lives would change, and how much my year as president of ESEABOTA would change. We got back on March the 12th, and so many things happened on March the 12th to change this country. So it's ironic we're doing the show now. I remember being in Amsterdam on March the 12th, and the word that we received was that there would be an international travel ban and you couldn't enter the country. And so I was sitting on the plane to go to Atlanta, and I said, please let this plane leave. I was so worried. And we got back to Atlanta. No one was wearing masks at that point in time. There was nothing different that day, but everything changed in a few days after that.
So I quickly want to touch on the issue. You've talked about all the change that's gone on. COVID's been one of the things that's gone on. Also, the Black Lives Matter protests have gone on. And as we sit here today, we're starting to deal with some of the aftermaths of some of the things that have gone on. We're getting vaccinations for COVID. And in fact, the George Floyd trial is in jury selection. Apparently, they do allow voir dire in Minnesota, where that's taking place. How do you see, or do you see that our justice system has been changed by the Black Lives Matter movement?
After George Floyd was killed, and we had the outpouring of concern and support of the Black Lives Matter movement, I had a lot of hope at that time. I thought that our country was progressing to a point that I didn't think we would get to. That hope that I have now because of that has been followed by despair, because I think that now it's clear that our country is more divided than any time that I can remember since the days when I was involved in civil rights as a young person growing up in Orangeburg. This is a very scary time from my perception, that there's just so much hate and people are so open with it. When, after Reconstruction, you had an institutionalized effort to take away the rights of African Americans, their voting rights, their civil rights. And what I see in legislatures all over the country now with voting is I see a return to those post-Reconstruction policies. It really makes me sad to see where we are right now, to see the open hate that I see in this country now. I was in a mediation Monday, and I was saying to the lawyers on my side of the case that I really worry about what's going to happen with jury trials. I said, first of all, in a civil case, we have people whose economic situation has been so affected by the pandemic. How will they award damages now in that regard? We have a country that's so full of hate and people are so open about it. How will a jury trial take place, and how will people of color be affected by juries now? And I'm frightened about that prospect. I really am. I really hope that at some point in time, this country will be able to engage in some healing and get away from looking at people differently and judging people based on the color of their skin or their economic background. And I think we're at a critical juncture in this country. As president of SEABOTA, I wrote a column after George Floyd was killed, and I talked about it being an inflection point to equal justice. And I really think we're at an inflection point in our country where I hope that at some point in time, we can look at ourselves and think about treating people better and treating people and not discriminating people against people based on their backgrounds and their race. And I think that we're at a bad place right now, a really bad place, that I'm not sure will change in my lifetime.
I agree with you, Luther. And we have a couple of cases here in Georgia that we're dealing with that I think Ahmaud Arbery happened after George Floyd, but I don't know if you followed Ahmaud Arbery, the shooting, what I would say was the murder of Ahmaud Arbery by two white men who, I don't even want to get into it. It's just so awful what they did to him. They killed him in cold blood. And then we also have Rayshard Brooks, which is a police shooting of an African-American here in downtown Atlanta. And Ahmaud Arbery that trial's going to be tried before the end of the year. I don't know about Rayshard Brooks, but I'm praying that the jury in the Ahmaud Arbery trial, it's really State v. McMichael, does the right thing. Because we've now eliminated, our legislature eliminated the citizens arrest law just recently, thank goodness.
A unanimous vote too, by the way, in the House.
And passed a hate crimes bill in Georgia, which I thought I'd never see, but that's a big step for us.
Robin, I remember a few years back watching a program that used to come on ESPN. It was called The Sports Reporters. And it was a very intelligent discussion that took place on Sunday with some of the best sports writers in the country. and there was a man, William Roden, from the New York Times, and he talked about the issue of race in this country. And you two are probably too young to remember this, but when I was at Emory, I had a turntable and a receiver, and I listened to my music that way. And William Roden said that when you had that stereo setup, that even when you turned off all the power, there was a hum. There was a hum there. And he says that's the issue of race is a hum that's always there. And we just can't get past that. We can't get past it.
Well, Luther, Lester and I both have adult children. Lester's kids are a couple of years older than my kids, but they're in the same generation, and they are all like-minded. They cannot believe that the way we treat people, they cannot believe we still have racism in America. It's just unbelievable to them. And so I guess what I'm saying is my hope is in this generation that I have to have an entire generation of kids like Lester's kids and my kids saying, we're not putting up with this, not one more day, period.
Right. Well,
so there's hope, but it's a long time coming.
There's a saying, as I breathe, I hope. So I have to have hope that we can be better. I have to have hope.
That's the South Carolina motto, as I recall.
Yeah.
Georgia's wisdom, justice, and moderation is certainly something we need to live up to a little more here.
You know, I found as president of EMOTA, when it came to doing resolutions, taking a stand, we were really affected by the divide in this country. And if you took a position that affected a statement, maybe a popular politician had made, and if you took a position protecting the rule of law or the independence of judges, if it involved well-known politicians, it was perceived as being political rather than taking a legal stand. And so it made for a very difficult year. One of the things that I said was, as president, I would not be partisan in what I did. You know, I would avoid politics when possible and would never be partisan. So I tried to adhere to that during the year I was president, but it was a challenge.
Well, it's, and some of that is what Martin Luther King spoke of when he talked about the silence of our friends, to not speak up in the face of some of the things that we see today, to me, is just, just wrong. The silence is wrong,
right,
about that. Well, I'm going to ask this. Robin had some great questions on here, so I'm going to ask you some quick questions to try to finish it out before we get to our favorite question, which we've warned you about, which is right. What is justice? But what would you say is the highlight of your career?
Well, I would say I have two highlights. The obvious highlight was, being elected president of EMOTA and having the chance to lead a prestigious organization of 7,600 lawyers during one of its most challenging years during a pandemic. We had a chance to adapt to that, to do the first two virtual meetings, to do some great seminars. I appointed a COVID-19 task force, which gave lawyers in courts a blueprint around the country about how to conduct jury trials in a pandemic environment. My other high moment is I was asked by Judge Perry. He left instructions for me to speak at his funeral. He was my hero. I think one of the greatest lawyers of our time. The other people on the panel were Congressman Jim Clyburn, the Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court, 2 federal judges, and me. And to be selected to speak at his funeral, not being of the standards and caliber of those people was just a high point. His funeral was broadcast on South Carolina Public Television. And that was just an honor for me because I loved him. He was my mentor. He was my friend. I got to take him to football games. He's just a rock star. And that was a high point for me.
Best win.
Best win was not an obvious type of case. I represented a family of a man who had a $35 Gulf oil bill he didn't pay. And they got a judgment against him and took about 20 acres of his parents' family land. South Carolina, the Gulf oil was represented by a man named Mayor Pro, who was the senator, head of the Senate, in his hometown of St. Matthews, South Carolina. And I went to court, got that reversed, and got the family their land back. I beat Mayor Pro in his hometown.
That's great.
And it wasn't a case that I got a big fee, but I got the greatest settlement.
I bet you didn't get paid much on that case either.
But I value that case so much because I saw the system taking advantage of him and taking advantage of his family and stealing his family's land, and I got his land back, the family land back.
Do you have Robin and I, we're big bourbon fans. In fact, we were both president of Georgia Bar. We did a little mix your own cocktail thing at one point in time about how to make a bourbon and ginger ale. So that's sort of been our ritual. If we have a good win, do you have a ritual that you follow after a big win?
I like single malt Scotch. I like to have to drink some single malt Scotch and have a great meal when I have a big win.
Well, Luther, I can't tell you how I've just really enjoyed this today. It's just been wonderful to have you on. And I think as you and I have talked before with your connection to Georgia and mine to South Carolina, and Robin's got a little South Carolina connection there as well.
Little.
It's just it's so great. I feel like all the worlds have merged here.
Let me say something before you ask him our final question. Luther, you mentioned many times your mentor, Judge Perry, but I just want to say, I can only guess how many young people and young lawyers especially have Luther Battiste as their mentor and who they look up to.
You're very kind. I didn't mention this. Let me mention one last thing about Judge Perry. When I left Emory Law School, came back to Columbia and went to practice with I.S. Levy Johnson, the offices that I worked at were formerly the offices of Jenkins, Perry, and Pride. My first office was Judge Perry's former office in his law offices. My first office was Judge Perry's office. Can you imagine that connection?
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Well, Luther, tell us how do you define justice? What is justice to you?
Well, justice means a lot to me. First of all, I define justice as meaning treating people the way they should be treated. I also look at it as fairness. Justice has a particular meaning to me because I grew up in a small town, Orangeburg, South Carolina, that was segregated. And I fought so hard through the civil rights movement to achieve justice. First of all, for African Americans. When you achieve justice for African Americans, you achieve justice for everyone. Because in order for us to be a better state, a better city, a better country, we all have to treat each other fairly. We all have to try to achieve justice in how we treat people. I wanted to be a lawyer because, as I said, Matthew Perry was fighting for justice to free all Americans. And I've spent my entire life trying to make a difference, trying to make Columbia and South Carolina and this country a better place in any way I can by trying to make people do what's right, to treat people fairly, and to try to make us live up to the ideals of what this country was founded on. And that's my sense of justice.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Luther. We really appreciate it. Robin and I always try to have a news article that we bring to the attention of our listeners each week. And so, Robin, since you made me be the leadoff hitter today, I'm going to let you be the leadoff on your news article for today.
All right. Well, thank you, Lester. It's actually not a news article for me. Sometimes I want to talk about a significant case, and I want to talk about what I think is a significant case that the Georgia Supreme Court issued just in the last few weeks. And without any fanfare, and you may have missed it, but it's called Nuckolls v. State. And it had to do with a video camera secretly placed in a resident of a long-term care facility's home in a room, the resident's room. And typically what happens in that situation is a family member starts to suspect there's been some sort of abuse to their family member. So they smartly put in a secret camera, and it can be any kind of camera, like a Ring camera that you have on your door or something like that. But they put it in there, but they don't tell the caregivers they're filming what's going on. And this happened in this case, and the caregiver was brought up on some charges, some criminal charges, because the son suspected abuse, placed a secret camera in his father's room, takes it to the police, and this caregiver is charged with some criminal violations. The attorneys for the caregiver then argue that the video from the secret camera should not be admissible because they didn't own that room. It wasn't their home, and they didn't have any right to put a camera in this person's workplace. Up until this case, it was questionable whether that was legal, putting a secret camera in a resident's room in a long-term care facility. It was questionable whether you could do that. And this case, Nuckolls v. State, dealing with the criminal aspect, said it is admissible. The video was going to be admissible. The caregiver had no right of privacy in this person's home while she's caring for him in the room. It's not his home, in his room in a long-term care facility, that she didn't have a right of privacy. And number two, the resident was going to be considered the occupier of the premises. And for those reasons, the videotape was ruled admissible. So I think this has some long reach going into civil cases. This was a criminal case, but I think it's going to be able to be applied in civil cases, such as nursing home malpractice or any kind of situation where you have a case against a long-term care facility where you suspect abuse of your loved one. It now will be admissible evidence when you record that abuse without the abuser's knowledge, without the caregiver's knowledge. It's perfectly legal and okay for a family member to do that. So I blogged about that in my blog, which you can find at atlantainjurylawyerblog.com or on my website, gatriallawyers.net. I blogged about it a little bit more at length. And I think the larger picture is everything, just assume everything's videotaped these days. Everybody has a camera. We're walking around with one in our pocket or our purse. We talked about Ahmaud Arbery's murder earlier in this show, and the truth of it is no one would be held responsible for the murder of Ahmaud Arbery unless there was a videotape of it. That's the bottom line. And same with caregivers in long-term care facilities. No one's going to be held responsible unless you can prove it with video. And now this Nuckolls case is a great step forward for family members of residents.
Absolutely, and we'll give people some peace of mind too about what's going on with their loved ones. Well, my article today, Robin, is from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution from February the 19th of 2021, written by Bill Rankin, and it's essentially the obituary of my friend and mentor, Bobby Lee Cook, who passed away at the age of 94, only about a week, I think it was a week to the day after his 94th birthday. To say the name Bobby Lee Cook, for most Georgians, exactly who we're talking about. if you're in the minority and don't know who he was reputed to be the model for the TV show Matlock. He practiced law in Summerville, Georgia for well over 50 years, practiced with his daughter and with his grandson, Sutton Conley. He was a true friend and a true mentor to me. I think one of the things that is his legacy, at least as far as I'm concerned, is that, we hear a lot about great lawyers in New York City and big cities like Atlanta, where you are, but there are a lot of people that think you can't really be a great lawyer and be out in a small town. And he had an international law practice. He had tried cases in many, many states, had tried court martials in Vietnam and Germany, had just an extraordinary career. And one of the things that I think that I admire the most about him, a lot of people, you'll say, well, so-and-so passed away and he was the governor, or, she was a justice on the Supreme Court, or he served in Congress or something like that. They're known by some position, that they had. And the thing that Bobby Lee Cook was really known was for what he actually accomplished in the courtroom. He tried over 300 murder trials, and was just an extraordinary lawyer. Went to your alma mater, Vanderbilt Law School, and his passing, while certainly sad, also is something that you have to celebrate for somebody that's had the remarkable life that he had. And of course, we've talked about maybe having some of the family and friends on later to commemorate that life, but I thought it was worthy of inclusion today as my article. Anything else for the good of the order before we sign off today, Robin?
I would just like to say that Bobby Lee was one of a kind. And no, I have nothing else. So until next time, we'll see you in court.
Thank you for listening to See You in Court, brought to you by the Georgia Civil Justice Foundation and the Georgia Institute of Technology. Please subscribe to this podcast and consider writing a review. You may find related documents to this week's episode on our website, seeyouincourt.podbean.com. Please send any questions, suggestions, or ideas to seeyouincourtpodcast@gmail.com. The producer of this podcast is Raz Misher. We thank Noreen Hassan, Associate Professor and Director of Outreach and Community Engagement of the Georgia Institute of Technology School of Literature, Media, and Communication, and the Georgia Tech students who help bring you this podcast. I'm Fred Smith, Executive Director of the Georgia Civil Justice Foundation. You may learn more about the foundation at fairplay.org. On behalf of Robin Frazier-Clark and Lester Tate, until our next episode, we'll see you in court.